I'm Beverly, a 24-year-old business major. I could say I had a pretty privileged upbringing, but that wouldn't be entirely true. My parents were childhood neighbors and then high school sweethearts and married soon after graduation. Doing the math now, I believe it was because my mother became pregnant with my eldest brother, Louis. I came a year later. Then 4 years after, came my baby brother Ellis. Needless to say, being sandwiched between two brothers had its own challenges while growing up. My eldest brother Louis was my father's clone. They did everything together and spent a lot of time bonding and doing guy stuff. I, on the other hand, was much of a loner. I rather enjoyed being to myself and doing my girly stuff with my imaginary friends. So, when my youngest brother Ellis came around, my mother had another baby to dote on. He is definitely a mama's boy. My mother was always a stay-at-home mom, while my father did a stint in the military. Initially we followed him from country to country. But once we became older and had to attend school, they decided my brother and I needed more stability and we moved to the suburbs near our family in the States. Over the years, I can't say I was necessarily close to my father, but he was my father and I loved him. With him being gone so often while I was younger, I admit I really didn't know him well at all. But Louis never forgot him. They were buddies and shared a unique bond. Louis emulated my father in all things, until you could hardly tell them apart, from facial features to mannerism. Then goals in life. So right out of high school, Louis joined the military as well. But I'm not here to tell you about how uneventful my life was growing up. That would be a lie. I adore my family and we were all very close, though we had very unique and differing personalities. But to be honest, we were allowed our individuality growing up. That was the one thing my parents always agreed upon. Let her make up her own mind, or, let him do his own thing, my father would often say to my mother. Even when my baby brother Ellis thought he wanted to be a dancer, my father told my mother to leave him alone. He'll either love it or hate it. Let him decide, my father would say. So, my father always seemed level-headed and rational, where my mother appeared to be melodramatic and emotional. Either way, they seemed to complement one another from what I could see by observing them. Then it all came crashing down. I don't know where it all went wrong for them, but I remember I was 8 years old at the time when there was a knock at the door. I grew up in a time when children were to stay in a child's place when grown-ups were talking, but I was a nosy child. So I eavesdropped on the conversation they were having in the living room. I had never seen the woman who had come to see my mother, but she had a little girl with her. She was about 5 years old at the time and very cute and smiley, but fidgety and impatient. All she wanted to do was go over and play with the toys we had scattered in the living room, but the woman kept holding her back from wandering off by holding her hand tightly. If I had a little sister I would want it to be her, I remember thinking to myself. I recall my mother burst into tears then telling the woman to get out. The strange woman began to cry as well, making the little girl cry too. She was begging my mother to take the little girl. She kept pushing her towards my mother and my mother kept pushing the little girl back towards the woman. The little girl, looking like a rag doll in a reverse tug-o-war, cried even harder. But my mother won and slammed the door on the woman and child. I could hear them both crying on the other side of the door. The woman kept saying, "Please take her. There's no one else. Please." My mother yelled on the inside of the door, "Go away." But they both kept crying. I could even hear the little girl's cries as she and the woman walked away from our house. After that incident, I remember my mother gathering me and my brothers and telling us we were moving and would no longer live with my father. And as I've said before, I was indifferent. I wasn't close to him, but he was my dad. But Louis took it the hardest. He fought with my mother and threatened to run away if she didn't allow him to live with our dad. Ellis, of course, was a mama's boy. Wherever she went, he was closely behind. I can't count how many times I had to feed myself and my little brother during this time. Yeah. I learned that mac and cheese and SpaghettiOs and canned beans don't really go together. But we didn't starve, so that was the objective at the time. Months later, mainly because Louis was constantly running away and unable to cope with their separation, my parents announced they were going to give their marriage another try. They declared they still loved each other, but was going through a rough patch, as they put it. I admit, I was happy to hear they were giving it another try. My mother had been so mopey and sad since the breakup and the depression had set in so deep, I thought she would just lay in bed and die from the heartbreak. But it was a conversation I overheard between my mother and aunt that shed light on what was going on around me. "What did Eddie do with the little girl?" my aunt asked my mother. "Little girl, what little girl?" My mother said angrily, "I don't know and I don't care. If we're going to remain married, she can't stay here. I'm not raising his affair baby." Affair baby? What's an affair baby? Have you heard anything more about the mother? My aunt asked my mother. Last I heard, she's not doing too well. But I can't. I just can't raise another woman's child. No matter the circumstances. He cheated on me, and now they're trying to guilt me into raising the baby because the mother is dying. No. I won't do it, my mother said. Then my mother added in a whisper, but I could still hear her, "Whatever you do, don't ever mention it to the kids. They don't know their father has another child. They would be heartbroken if they find out." I was 10 years old when I learned about this. One of the conditions for my parents remaining married was, he could never bring up this affair again, and he could have nothing to do with the little girl. That was the stipulation. And as far as I know, no matter if he really wanted to do it or not, he kept to his end of the bargain. There was no mention of the little girl or her mother ever again. But during my junior year of high school, my life as I knew it changed. I had friends who kept coming to me about this girl who looked just like me. They kept asking me if I had a sister. Well, of course I didn't. Everyone knew I had 2 brothers. One was an athlete and overachiever and the other was a nerdy mama's boy. I was the only girl in my family. Yet, they kept insisting. "You have to meet her. She looks just like you," they'd say. Then one day, when we were leaving for the day, I spotted her. Immediately the little girl who visited with the mysterious woman came to mind. She was much older now, but I remembered her. She had the same cute smiley expression hidden behind a nervous fidgety persona. The other students told me her name. Lenora Johnson. The knowledge I carried deep within my subconscious suddenly burst through. Was Lenora the little girl who came to the house? Is she my dad's affair baby my mother and aunt were talking about? Does this mean I have a little sister? These questions began to overwhelm my thoughts. Should I talk to her? Should I ignore her? What to do? One day, when I felt brave enough to find answers, I approached my dad. My mother was upstairs and he was in the kitchen pouring himself a glass of lemonade. I placed my backpack on the counter and sat down. "Dad, can I ask you a question?" He looked over at me. "Of course. What's on your mind, kiddo?" "Do I have a little sister?" I asked bluntly. My father was the no-nonsense type, so there was really no other way to broach the subject. Straight to the point was the best way to deal with him. He hesitated for a brief moment and his body stiffened. Then he slammed the door and grabbed me by the arm and dragged me out into the garage. "Where did you hear this?" "Who told you that?" he asked through gritted teeth. I overheard it. Mom and Auntie were talking about it, and I overheard them," I stammered. He released the tight grip he had on my arm and said, "Never bring this up to me again. Do you hear me? Ever." And they never did. At least to my father. I could tell by his expression, there was a mix of pain, fear, maybe longing. I wasn't sure. Maybe he wanted to know his daughter and couldn't, for risk of losing the rest of his family. I couldn't tell. But the myriad of emotions that registered on his face made me confused. So, when I reached graduation, I was confronted by Lenora. She was still cute and bubbly, but now I was beginning to understand that underpinning of nervous energy she always exuded. "Can we talk?" she asked one day. I put on my cool, indifferent tone with her. "Talk about what?" "I don't know you." "I know. But can we go somewhere private?" "It won't take long," she said. I followed her out of the school and we walked a long while through the campus and to a secluded area. Then she spoke. "I know you don't know me, but we're sisters." "Our fault." I cut her off. "My father." She put her head down in shame. I could see a tear stream down her cheek. Something inside me wanted to hug her, but another part of me felt it would be a betrayal to my family. My mother especially. I resisted the urge. I wanted to approach Louis, but he looks, well, you know. He always looks so serious. So I was afraid to go to him. "But when I watch you over the years, you look easygoing and approachable. I just wanted you to know you have a sister." "I thought maybe we could have a relationship," she said nervously. "Look. I don't need or want a sister. You live your life and I'll live mine. Don't come to me again." "I'm not interested," I said this then stormed off. That was 2 years ago. I was away at college when my father died. I later learned it was from a massive heart attack while he slept. My mother was distraught, Louis was inconsolable and Ellis was quiet and to himself, as usual. So it was my responsibility to come home and prepare for all of the funeral arrangements and insurance and legal stuff that needed to be handled. Although my father didn't have a will, it was always understood that he wanted my mother to be taken care of and the remaining assets and money would be split evenly among his children. So, while rummaging through the drawers of his desk, I came across a paternity test for Lenora Johnson. It said it was 99.98% probability he was her father. And although I always knew this since I was 10 years old, it still came as a punch to the stomach. On the day before I had to return to school, I called a family meeting. "We need to go over Dad's stuff before we leave." "But..." My mom and brothers looked at me. I could tell they wanted to be anywhere but here. It was still raw and painful, and each wanted to go to their separate corners to grieve. But this was a necessary evil. So I continued. "We need to talk about Lenora," I said. My mother's eyes went wide. Louis and Ellis looked confused and bewildered. "Who the hell is Lenora?" Louis finally asked. I averted my eyes from my mother. "She's our sister." "Sister?" Louis and Ellis said simultaneously. Still not having the nerve to meet my mother's gaze, I continued. "Yes. Apparently Dad had an affair years ago and he has another daughter," I said, then placed the paternity test on the table. Louis snatched the paper up from the table and began reading it. The blood drained from his face. He looked pale. You could tell his idolization of our perfect father shattered in that moment. "What?" My mother just sobbed silently and dabbed her eyes. I think she always knew this day would come. She didn't say a word. After taking care of the things for Mom, Dad left us $1.2 million to split evenly to take care of college and maybe a down payment on a house. But I'm thinking we should. It was unanimous. Louis and Ellis cut me off before I could continue. Absolutely not. I will not share my inheritance with a Johnny-come-lately gold digger. If Dad didn't claim her, then neither will I, Louis said. Ellis pretty much echoed his sentiment then stormed out of the room. I went over to my mother and hugged her. "I'm sorry, Mom. I had to do this. It's only fair. I didn't mean to hurt you by bringing up a painful past." She patted my back and sobbed in my arms for a long while. Before we parted ways and went back to our respective lives. Louis went back to his military base and I to college and Ellis back to high school. The money was split 3-way. We each received $400,000. I understood where my brothers were coming from. Lenora was someone they never met, or even heard about in all these years. It seemed cruel to ask them to acknowledge her as an equal sibling when, up until just a moment ago, she didn't even exist in their minds. But I knew. I always knew about that sad little girl with the sweet smile. Several months later. During my summer break, I went back home to visit with my mother. She seemed to be in better spirits, though she still looked to be in mourning over my father's passing. No matter their hardships, they were still very close with each other, and it was a great loss for her. Still, my aunt kept her busy and occupied so she wouldn't fall into a depressive state. She looked to be adjusting well, which was a relief. But today, I had my own function to attend. It was graduation day. Something inside me was proud. I know I didn't have a right, but still. I was proud. Like a big sister. The name was announced, Lenora Johnson. I stood up and applauded the loudest and chanted her name. She looked around to see who it was, but I sat down before I could be exposed. But once it was over, I searched for her. I went to the area where everyone was taking pictures with their families and congratulating and celebrating one another. But I didn't see her at first. Then I spotted her sitting alone watching everyone with a broad smile on her face, though her eyes looked sad. She was happy for everyone, but there was no one here to celebrate with her. She was alone. My heart sank. "Lenora," I said as I approached her. She stood up and gave me the broadest smile. "Why are you sitting here alone? Where is everyone?" "What do you mean?" "You mean my family. In that case, you're seeing it." "I'm alone," she said through a smile, but her words were heavy and sad. "What?" "But," I stopped myself. "What right do I have? I rejected her and forgot about her and have no right to have righteous indignation on her behalf. I was no better than everyone else in her life." "Let's take some pictures," I said, then pulled out my phone. We made silly faces, funny faces, serious faces. Every pose you could think of. It was like we were making up for all the time we missed over the years. Long after everyone left, we were still snapping photos and laughing at how silly some of them looked. "Thank you for making this day special for me. I know it must be hard on you, since I'm not wanted. But, again, thank you. It means a lot to me," she said, then hugged me tightly for a long time. "We're sisters. I would never miss this special day. No matter what." "Here," I handed her an envelope with a card. I put my contact information inside. "Feel free to call me anytime. No matter what." After that day, my family learned I was establishing a relationship with Lenora, but they didn't interfere. But they also didn't want to have anything to do with knowing her, at least for now. I understood and never pressured them to do so. My mother sold the house and she and my aunt got a small condo together and live peacefully. I'm glad for her. They travel a lot when Ellis is free during breaks from school. But he's now preparing for college soon. So she'll have a lot more free time on her hands. But Lenora and I have established a strong sister bond with each other. She is quite literally the sister I always wanted, but never had, until now. She's sweet and loving and caring, and I adore her. She called me crying when she opened her card and received half of my inheritance, with a bankbook with $200,000 in it. It was only fair, I thought. Even though I couldn't make my brothers do this, I felt a sense of responsibility towards her. Maybe it was because I was the one who saw her, as a little girl, crying with her mother who was being pushed out of the house by my mother. Only to learn years later that her mother was dying and wanted someone to care for her daughter, and her father, who was my father, was who she thought would do it. I knew I couldn't make up for all the lost time and pain caused when she was younger, but I was definitely going to try to build the close loving relationship she never had with anyone. Including the evil aunt who ended up raising her when her mother passed. From now on, I will be my sister's keeper.
Thanks for listening to my story. Come back for more stories and help our channel grow. Bye.